Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here with you at the Yemei Iyun of Yeshivat Chobevei Torah. Thank you, Rav Yonah, for all your help. And I mean that going forward because I expect to need it. Okay, the text that we're going to be focusing on in the short time that we have is the text of the Akeda, which is, of course, the Torah reading for the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And I'm going to ask you to please appreciate how brave a move this is on my part to be addressing the Akeda, which is arguably the most difficult passage in all of Tanakh. My own disclaimer is in every year that I studied constant, every effort, I don't understand it, and I actually don't expect to ever fully understand this text. However, what I do want to do with you is each time I come at it, I try to attack it from a new angle. And the angles that I am partial to are literary angles. We're going to look at the Akeda from a literary perspective, which I believe is very much in line with the rabbinic dictum, Dibra Torah kilishon b'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in human language. Right? We are meant to understand it, and I understand this to mean that the tools of literary analysis that we recognize from analyzing any kind of text, we are blessed to have these tools. Let's use them to try to uncover layer after layer of meaning, additional meaning, getting a little closer to understanding more of a very, very difficult story.
Judy, in the interest of Dibra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam, I'll ask you to slow down a little bit so our captioner can speak kilshon b'nei Adam. Thank you. You're doing great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, it's sort of along the same lines. The particular literary angle that I wanted to emphasize today is the angle of the text gaps, the silences that are built into our text. I would like to argue that these silences are very artful in nature. They can help draw us in, and when we recognize them and we follow them, they can often present themselves as vehicles to uncovering greater meaning. Okay, the fancy term for this is an ellipsis. We find something that's missing in the text itself. An ellipsis can refer to words, to phrases, to portions of a story that are simply left out. And we are so used to dealing with ellipses in our daily lives, in addition to in literature, that we often don't even notice when we are engaging in elliptical language. We say things like, not another word, or just a second, right? And of course, there are all kinds of words that are implied in there that we don't state. And the reason we don't have to say all those words is because, first of all, the listener understands our full intent. And by leaving out certain words, we've managed to convey not only the content of what we're saying, but by the very fact that we've sped things up, we are also conveying a certain message of urgency, right? And these kinds of cut off sentences often have more life than would have a fuller, more grammatical sentence, right? In literature, these kinds of statements are everywhere, right? Richard III, the king cries, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, right? Skipping unnecessary words, right? Give me a horse, I will give my entire kingdom in return for a horse. But this helps us move forward quickly, feeling the urgency of that moment. Okay, not yet. Okay, so in the service of good cohesive storytelling, we need to streamline, keep out details that don't matter. But there's also sometimes a second opposite function in literary silences, and this can be no less artful than the first. Sometimes I would argue even more so. Sometimes a silence is there not just to speed us up, as in cases such as this, the one that we saw with Shakespeare, but to actually slow us down, not to take attention away from the missing words, but to get us to focus more attention on those words. What might those missing words have been all about? The silence actually draws us in more closely. Okay, here's a more lowbrow example than Shakespeare. What came to my mind was the TV blockbuster Dallas. This was a phenomenon in the 1980s, especially here in Israel, where we had one channel, and on that channel we had one imported American drama, and it was this ridiculous soap called Dallas. And you could follow, I remember the days where you could follow the plot of this program simply by walking down the street, because every single home was listening to the same thing at the same time. And there was this buildup for weeks. They had this terribly evil main character named JR. Everybody hated him. Everybody had good cause to kill him. They all had motive. And then they cut. You don't see who kills him, but all of a sudden you see JR lying in a pool of blood for 8 months. They skipped over that gap, and right, everybody, what is keeping people occupied throughout those 8 months is who shot JR, right? If they had told you, you wouldn't have paid nearly as much attention to it. There were 350 million people around the world who tuned in to the Who Done It episode. And so many eyes were on JR that the Republican presidential campaign of 1980 had this campaign button. A Democrat shot JR, right? That was it. Anyway, my point is that in literature, in film, in Tanakh, as we're about to see, sometimes an artfully placed silence can speed us up. Sometimes it can slow us down. Either way, a great deal is communicated through silence. Okay, in Tanakh, we're ready now, with this as background, to approach the inscrutable text of the Akeda. And here, let's look at, before we get to the bigger silences, there are two really enormous silences, I think, that animate this entire story. But before we get to that, I want to start with an example of a silence that will help us build toward those other silences. Okay, this is toward the end of the story, and I'm going to assume that everyone has some level of familiarity with the story. At the end of the story, after the murder of the slaughter of Yitzhak has been called off at the last moment, it seems like it's a happy ending to the story, and then we have this very, very unusual pasuk: Vayashov Avraham el na'arav, vayakumu vayachu yachdav el Be'er Sheva, vayeshev Avraham be'Be'er Sheva. Right, Abraham returned to his lads. They arose and went together to Be'er Sheva. Okay, and everybody, of course, wants to know what's the big silence here. What's missing? Okay, that's a question that I know you're all answering inside your heads, but I'm going to give you an opportunity in a moment to answer, not just in your heads, but in chat. The big silence here is, there were two of them who went up to that mountain. And in fact, Vayelchu Shnehem Yachdav, Avraham and Yitzchak went together. We have that phrase twice. But when they come back, it's all of a sudden in the singular, Avraham alone returned to his lads, the lads that we recall he had said to Yitzchak, Shivu lachem po im hachamor, you stay behind, you can't go where Yitzchak and I are going. Now all of a sudden he comes back without Yitzchak, and this Yachdav, instead of being together with Yitzchak, he's together with these Ne'arim. Something very, very monumental has happened here. But the biggest question here is, what happened to Yitzchak? Okay, now here's where we're going to experiment together for a moment at some form of interaction in this very, very challenging mode of interaction between us. And that is the following. I'm going to ask you to write in the chat, just take 1 minute, think about the question that I've just posed, and just write your immediate response to, what do you think happened to Yitzchak? Why is Yitzchak not in this verse? Okay, and Rav Yonah is going to be kind enough to read out your answers as they come in.
Right. As a reminder, the chat button is usually located at the bottom of your screen. It's the little button that says chat on it, with a little balloon. Type in something there, and then in about a minute, I'll call out your responses to everyone else to hear. There's already a couple that have come in.
Excellent.
By the time my family made Aliyah in the 1980s, Judy, it was LA Law, not Dallas.
Yeah. This is very good. They say in mindfulness, you're supposed to think about one thing at a time. So we were very good at that for a very long time when it came to television.
Comments are coming into the chat. Remember to hit the return button to make sure that we all see what you're writing, everyone. We'll give people another 30 seconds or so.
Yeah. Okay.
People are still commenting, but I'll start to read what's at the top here.
Yeah.
One sec. Sorry. Okay, here we go. Let's see what we got. Oh, there's a lot. Wow, a lot of you. People are active this morning. Your Sunday morning fingers are working. Okay. So we've got. I'm just going to read them all out, Judy, and you'll take it from there. He went to the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, according to the Midrash. He upset at his father, so he didn't go with him. He went to heaven. Yitzchak could have been killed, or Yitzchak was so upset with his father that he did not want to travel back with him. He had to be alone for some time. He refused to go back with dad. He gets a status other than son or lad, Na'ar, after the Akeda. Yitzchak, traumatized, refused to believe his father could actually do this and misunderstand Hashem's command. He couldn't bear to travel with his father. He needed to process more. He stayed on top of the mountain. Yitzchak remained alone to meditate, which began his lifelong practice of trying to come to terms with this trauma. The Achdab highlights the irony. Wow. Yonah Berman comments that the Midrash says that he actually was killed. It was one Midrash. He was in a heightened state, distance from Abraham, emotionally changed. Question of doesn't it depend on how old Yitzchak was? Someone writes 3 or 17. I'll update that and say that the Midrash, the range of 3 to 37 years old, in fact. And finally, from Ilana, perhaps Yitzchak was there, but for some reason, he's no longer relevant to the story.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you. Those were yeah. Okay. I'm going to take it from here. Those are right on target. It's interesting to me that nobody went the route of Radak. Radak in 12th, 13th century France, who David Kimchi, who says, "Ve'ein tzarich lomar ki Yitzchak haya imo, elo zachar Avraham ki hu ha'ikar." What's Radak's view of things? He's not missing at all. He's there. Why doesn't it say that he's there? Because it's obvious that he's there. We were told that he went, so we must infer that he came back. All right, this goes along with what we saw earlier, the speeding up school of understanding silences, where we can skip things if they are if we assume that they will be understood by our audience. Okay, so Radak is going with that, which might be considered a kind of pshat way of looking at things. He's there. Everybody said, all of you who responded said something else, basically what's in line with the Chizkuni and with the Midrashim. And I agree with every one of you that we need to find more in this. It seems the text, the absence is so stark that it seems to be inviting this question so that we can begin to speculate as to what happened to Abraham. And then the responses can really span a very broad spectrum of possibilities. Here we have Chizkuni, and some of you mentioned this, either he's in Gan Eden, he's learning in a yeshiva, right? If a young man is missing, of course he found a yeshiva to learn in, right? But basically this is talking about a kind of retreat in some figurative sense. Yitzchak doesn't ever return from the Akeda. He goes to some other place. He's on a new spiritual plane. And this, as we see, there are echoes of this in many different places, including Rashi. Later in Bereshit Kavav, when God gives Yitzchak the command to stay in Eretz Yisrael, the only one of the 3 Avot who was given that command, Rashi explains why. Why does he have this order? And Rashi's answer is, right, he should do what his father did, which is when there's a famine, go to a place that has food. But he said to him, and somebody mentioned this terminology, Amar lo al tered Mitzrayma she'ata olat tmima. In some sense, you are the eternal burnt offering, even though the stay of execution, right? That you weren't slaughtered at the last moment, but in some sense, you never really came down from that mountain. You don't belong outside of this holy land. You have achieved an otherworldly sense of spirituality that in some way you actually can never return to this land.
Judy, reminder to please slow down a little for captioning. Thank you.
Slow down.
You're doing great. Thank you so much.
Okay. In another sense, there's another angle on this, and several of you in your responses, I think we're tapping into this, that we could say that Yitzchak never fully returns, but not necessarily because he is on a different spiritual plane, but because there's an emotional break between father and son. In some, right? And we can't even begin to imagine what kind of trauma is brought on by a father holding a flesh-eating knife over his son, fully ready to slaughter him at God's command. Even, right, is this a happy ending, even if God says, actually, don't do it? And here we look at this, and as I was kind of alluding to earlier, I think we have a couple of indications, possible subtle supports in the text for this way of looking at things. For instance, here's another silence. When God first gives the order, God says, Kach na et bincha et yichidecha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. Yitzchak is described as your son, your only son, whom you love. Look what happens at the end, after the order is rescinded. Yitzchak is described as bincha et yichidecha. Your son, your only son. What's missing here? Asher ahavta. The love seems to vanish in the description of the relationship between father and son. So it seems that something happened here. The absence of Yitzchak is highlighted, right? We're not meant to skip over it. We're meant to focus in on it and to understand from that absence some shift in the dynamic, whether that's a spiritual shift or whether that's an emotional shift. All of that is communicated by this little silence in the singular of Abraham's return. And of course, there's so much writing on how we interpret that silence. Does the Akeda have a happy ending where everyone returns and everything is called off and we'll go back to normal? Or does it have a tragic ending in that that split is never really mended and it becomes permanent between father and son? Okay, so the silence matters. It matters in how we understand the story as a whole. Okay, but that was just a warm up for the really, really big silence. I would say the two biggest silences in this story. The first one, first and perhaps biggest, is when God appears to Abraham out of nowhere. The text tells us that God is testing Abraham, and that is a can of worms of a whole other persuasion that is for another time. But what God says to him is, Kach na et bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak v'lech lecha el eretz haMoriah v'ha'alehu sham le'olah. Bring him up as a burnt offering. Basically, I am commanding you to kill your son. Okay, what's the gaping, enormous, massive chasm in this story? The unfilled gap, the silence. The silence, of course, is any rationale, any justification for God's command, right? It's just this cold order that flies in the face of. Let's start with biblical theology, right? The God of the Torah is against child sacrifice. Here is the God of the Torah seeming to order child sacrifice. This flies in the face of God's philosophical system, God's ethical system, right? God has emphasized again and again the centrality of tzedakah umishpat, justice, righteousness. And here there is nothing that could be construed as justice or righteousness. There's no way to account for this kind of order. It goes against God's trustworthiness, right? God has made promises to Abraham, and all the promises hinge on Abraham's having children. And here now is God saying, take your child and obliterate him, thereby just canceling all of those promises. Okay, that is massive gap number one. And massive gap number two is, of course, Abraham's response. What is Abraham's response? Vayashkem Avraham baboker. This string of verbs instead of, right? He wakes up, he saddles his donkey, he takes his lads, he chops the wood, he gets up, he goes. 6 verbs, action, action, action. But what is so noticeably missing is any kind of verbal response, no kind of argument. And we're the readers, we're looking at this and we're thinking, well, why doesn't he argue this? Why doesn't he say that? All the things that Abraham could have said but doesn't. And this is, of course, made so much more pressing when we think about the background, when we think about Abraham's past, the Abraham that we have come to know up until this moment, right? This is the Abraham who is a man of words, a man of response, even a man of challenge and protest, right? Just before, as we well know, just before God hits the destruct button for the evil cities of Sodom and Amorah, God indulges in this rare act of internal musing where God says, well, how can I not inform my loyal servant Abraham about what I'm going to do? After all, Ki yida'ativ, I have singled him out, lema'an asher yitzaveh et banav et beito acharav, in order that he will command his children and his household after him, v'shamru derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat. They will keep the way of the Lord by doing what is just and right. Okay, there's an awful lot going on here. And just in brief, to unpack it a little bit, first of all, we notice that this is filling in yet another silence, which is why did God choose Abraham to begin with? In chapter 12, Lech Lecha, one fine day, God says, get going, Abraham, with no buildup, no explanation. What makes him the worthy choice? And that's where the Midrashim are born, about a fiery furnace and the budding little iconoclastic monotheist Abraham who finds God on his own. None of that is in the text. We have to wait 6 chapters until God finally explains to us, to the reader, why God chose Abraham to begin with. And why is that? Not because of anything that he has done, not because he was courageous and self-sacrificing or more righteous. It's not biglal, right? The Hebrew word is not because of something that Abraham has done, nothing at all. But lema'an. Lema'an is a future-oriented word. I chose him in order to do something. I chose him for a solemn task, a responsibility going forward. And more remarkable than that is if we can pare down to 2 words what that responsibility is. There are 2 words that are synonymous with each other, tzedakah u'mishpat. Your service is purveying justice in the world. Okay, now, this is remarkable in many, many ways, right? God doesn't say anything about anything ritual, right? God doesn't say, I chose you so that you could make sure that every eating establishment has a glatt kosher hechsher on it. God says, tzedakah u'mishpat, this is what I want you to do. And again, it's future oriented. Don't feel like triumphal about this. Feel the weight of that responsibility. Okay, now, what happens almost immediately after this, I wanted you to keep your eye on these 2 words, tzedakah u'mishpat, because almost immediately after God says this, Abraham learns the lesson and says, oh, you chose me to promote and purvey, disseminate tzedakah u'mishpat in the world. How about if I start right now? And how about if I do that by arguing against you, God? And what we have immediately in 10 very long-winded verses is Abraham's impassioned plea to God on behalf of these wicked people of Sodom and Amorah, using the root tzadi dalid kuf, tzedakah, using the word mishpat over and over and over. The root tzadi dalid kuf comes 7 times, the word mishpat 3 times. over and over, basically what Avraham is saying to God, and here I would say the closest he gets to it in this incredible crescendo, which seems to be filled with nothing less than a large dose of chutzpah. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. You have chosen me to purvey mishpat. Where's yours? Let's see, God. You start the ball rolling by showing it, by demonstrating it here in Sodom and Amorah. And what is the most amazing thing about this passage is that time after time, Abraham is using his words so carefully, so artfully, so persuasively that God backs down time after time after time. Until ultimately God agrees that if there are 10 people in this city who don't deserve to die, that the entire city will be spared. Sadly, there aren't even 10, and the city does not survive anyway. But the important, for us, for our purposes, what's important here is Abraham's behavior, how he is the tzedek fighter, right? He is the person who goes to the barricades against God, saying, this is what I demand from you. And now we have a story where God now gives an order that isn't for an anonymous city of admittedly sinful people, but it's for Abraham, God's loyal servant, to destroy his future and for his innocent son to die for no apparent reason. Right? And here Abraham remains completely silent. Where are all of Abraham's words? Instead of words, we have frenetic action, we have verbs. Okay, so we've got these two enormous silences in this text. The silence regarding God's command, how could God command this? And the silence regarding Abraham's response or lack of response, a verbal response. Okay. I'm going to pause for a second. I wasn't going to do this, but if there are any pressing questions up until now, please write them in the chat, and I'm going to I'll do that before we move into the next piece.
I'll point out there are a couple of comments in the chat. Judy, would you like me to read them out for people, or do you want to wait on that?
Are they relatively brief?
We can wait till later and just keep moving.
Okay, I'm going to
how much
try.
time before the end? We have half an hour. So how much time before the end do you want me to give you a warning to sort of circle back in terms of questions?
I have half an hour. I would like a 5-minute warning, and a 5-minute warning for a 5-minute period for questions. In other words,
so
10
minutes before the end.
5 and 5 adds up to 10. Got it.
Fingers are working again. Great, no problem.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so on the way, and again, I want to get back to my initial disclaimer. I don't understand the Akeda. I don't expect to understand the Akeda. And if you are expecting me to explain the Akeda to you, please, it's not too late to go to a different shiur. I am simply trying to learn something, to find insight in the silences in the story. Okay, so we've looked so far at 3 big silences, well, 2 really big ones and 1 relatively big one. And in order to move toward insight, I want to keep asking and keep noting silences. Here's another one. Vayivaka atze olah, here in that frenetic list of verbs here, all of a sudden we're told, vayakom vayelech, he gets up and he goes, and then Bayom hashlishi, the 3rd day, vayisa Avraham et einav, vayar et hamakom merachok. On the 3rd day, Avraham lifted his eyes, he saw the place from afar. Okay, enormous silence here. What's happening on days 1 and 2? What do you mean on the 3rd day? If you're going to give us a marker of time, why not include what happens before this day that you seem to have chosen at random? Tell us what's happening all along. What's going on before this? So again, we can divide this into the point of view that wants to view a silence as a way to speed us up, and those who look at silences as a way to slow us down and to get us to focus in more, to dive into the silence, to imagine all that might be contained in it, and to try to understand the story in deeper and broader ways. Benno Jacob goes the first route. Benno Jacob, a 20th century Reform rabbi, fine reader of the text. 3 days are often the period for the preparation of important events. In other words, let's just get on with it. The third day, we don't need to talk about days 1 and 2 because nothing interesting happened. Why go out of your way to mention the third day? Just to let us know this journey, like all other journeys, requires 3 days of preparation. Move on and read what the text actually wants you to focus on. That's view number 1. View number 2, V Hoffman, also in the early 20th century in Germany, goes the other route. 3 days were given to Abraham to deliberate within himself, in which his beliefs would struggle with his natural emotions and defeat them. This victory did not come suddenly, but rather as a result of a stubborn, heroic struggle. Okay, what he's doing here is he's telling us we are supposed to ask ourselves and linger on the question, not what must have been going on during those previous 2 days. Let's indulge our imaginations here and imagine that we are Abraham, and while we are keeping our hands and our legs busy doing all kinds of things to just comply with God's command, our minds are running wild with questions and protests. And I am engaged in a stubborn, heroic struggle to just keep doing what I have to do. Right now, none of that is in the text itself, but according to in Hoffman's reading, that gap is left open for us so that we can begin to see that. We can imagine it and we can say to ourselves, that must have been happening. And here the Midrash agrees with this and really just dives into that gap, into that silence, and tells us a story about the Satan, right? This is a favorite literary device used by the Midrash to talk about, right, to kind of symbolize something. And in this case, it seems that what Satan is symbolizing are these inner doubts and struggles that are taking place within Abraham. Okay, and here let's just look at it in the English. The Satan accosted him and appeared to him in the guise of an old man. He asked him, "Where are you going?" He said, "To pray." He said, "Well, why would one who is going to pray have fire and a knife in his hand and wood on his shoulder?" Okay, that's conversation number 1. Then he, Satan, said to him, "Why would an old man like you kill a son who was born to him at the age of 100? He said, Abraham said, "Just for this," meaning this is what I'm doing it for God. And then the third statement of Satan, "Tomorrow they will say to you, 'Murderer, you have spilled his blood.' He said, 'Just for this.'" Okay, what the Midrash is doing is inviting us to, like Hoffman has suggested, inviting us to imagine what that conversation is about. And according to this reading, what that conversation is about is really 3 things, right? What's this first one? Where are you going to pray? Well, if you're going to pray, why do you have the implements of murder in your hand? Basically, that question is a ritual question. Why would someone, Abraham is asking himself, I'm going to serve God, but why do I need to kill my son? What kind of service of God is this? Right? How can this possibly be construed as serving God? Argument 2, Zaken, you old man, you're going to kill a child that you have after 100 years? What kind of argument is that? Okay, I can't hear you, but I know what you're all saying, right? There's the emotional level. I waited, yearned, pined for 100 years. Now I have this miracle child and God is telling me to kill him. This is the emotional turmoil that's going on within Abraham. And this third one, that tomorrow, Yomar Lecha, they're going to say to you, Shofech damata, you're a killer. What kind of argument is that? This is the ethical argument, right? The argument that you actually are a murderer. This is going against everything that God has told me to do, including, especially, purveying tzedakah umishpat in the world. How is this act consistent with what God has prepared me to become? this is the antithesis, in a nutshell, this is the antithesis of everything that God has said to me. Okay, so this, again, we've looked at this from two different angles, this silence about the 3 days. Is it to speed us up just to get there? Or is it to slow us down to say what is going on within Avraham? And that allows the Midrash and the Mefarshim to begin that imaginative journey. What are the likely thoughts and what are the likely feelings, attitudes, questions, challenges that Abraham is feeling on the deepest level, but is not allowing himself to express. Okay. Here is the third reading. This I first encountered with my teacher, Nechama Leibovitz, Zichrona Livracha. She was very fond of bringing in Eric Auerbach, who was a 20th century literary critic who compares the Homeric and biblical styles. And he basically agrees with Hoffman and the Midrash that the ellipsis, this silence of the 3 days is meant to slow us down, to encourage us to focus on what must have been going on during those 3 days. But there's a difference, and let's look at it together. A journey is made, but we are told nothing about the journey except that it took 3 days, and even that we are told in a mysterious way. It is as if while he traveled on, Abraham had looked neither to the right nor to the left, had suppressed any sign of life in his followers and himself, save only their footfalls. Thus, the journey is like a holding of the breath, a process which has no present, which is inserted like a blank duration between what has passed and what lies ahead, and which yet is measured 3 days. Okay, this is like Hoffman and like the Midrash, in that the silence is there to slow us down and get us to focus on what must have been happening. But unlike Hoffman and unlike the Midrash, he's not trying to supply the missing pieces. What are those words that remained inside Abraham but were never spoken? What he's seeing in this silence is that these 3 days are really about the kind of raw, primal emotion, none of which could be expressed or even formulated into words, even internally, right? The silence is a holding of the breath. It's a kind of an emotional earthquake erupting inside of Abraham. It's much too powerful to be captured by words of any sort. It's this kind of soul-piercing existential gasp, right? It goes with this active compliance with God's command. And this is in dramatic contrast with Abraham's Sodom mode of arguing and advocating, which up until now, the words that he has formulated and expressed have been his greatest strength. What he understands now is that his words are of no use to him. Right? And Auerbach goes on to say, it's not here on this on the screen, but he says that this ties in with the lack of adjectives, the whole style of the Akeda, where there are no markers. Is it day? Is it night? No adjectives to describe the knife, the wood, the mountain, right? Facts, everything, all extraneous details are irrelevant. We don't want to be limited in time or in space. We want this kind of wordless, raw emotion to take over. And here when I was looking at things the way that Auerbach does, it reminded me of another passage where we have an unspeakable situation. In fact, it's a parent losing, actually losing children, in this case, not one child, but 2 children, and with a very similar response. This is Aharon, Moshe's brother, when his 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, are killed for bringing a strange fire. That's a whole other story. But Abraham's response, and this is something that I think has really struck a chord with people throughout the generations, like hit us in a really deep emotional place. Vayidom Aharon, right? In emotional matters of this magnitude, we understand that no other response is possible. And this kind of silent response, and again, it's not just what comes out, it's also what's inside, right? It's not, the arguments are not taking place here. It's just a kind of implosion that's taking place, a wordless implosion. It reminded me of this very famous painting by Edward Munch, which is called The Scream. And he talks about this as being nature itself in kind of existential crisis. And nature itself, there's something so primal about this. It emits this scream. And I think this contorted face really manages to convey that feeling of something that is just too overwhelming, overpowering to be possibly put into words. And I'll just add that for me, as I was thinking about all of this, the equivalent of the scream in the modern state of Israel for me is the annual marking of Yom HaZikaron, where the nation draws together to mourn its many lost children through war, through terror. And I started thinking of it this way. It's a kind of communal Akeda, and this 2-minute siren where everybody is silent. It's a kind of, it reminded me of that silent 3-day journey of Aharon's mute response to the horrific news of the death of his sons. We, like Aharon and like Avraham, we hold our breath. Each of us in our own silent space, we reach into the deepest part of our souls. We connect personally to our own trauma, to the trauma of those around us, literally feeling completely just kind of embracing the sense of trauma and loss without trying to articulate anything. It's kind of a concentration of millions of simultaneous primal screams. But to get back to the Akeda and its silences, I want to argue that in this, basically where I'm going with all this, in this artfully constructed silence-infused passage, the way I see it is that medium and the message are one. Through substance and style, right? The style of silences and the substance of the silent internal screaming. The Akeda, I think, delivers the message that in everybody's lives, there's situations that words can't reach and sometimes shouldn't reach. Sometimes the events are simply so monumental. The silence that accompanies them are so total, right? Kind of like God's command that is devoid of any kind of logic or any kind of justice. We can't see any justice or logic in it. These are, all that's left to us is this kind of face contorting primal scream. And these Akeda moments stand apart from what we might call our Sodom moments, right? In our Sodom moments, like Avraham, I think we stand tall. We are masters of rationality. We judge everything that's happening around us. In Avraham's case, even judging God. We are the best defenders of ourselves and those that we care about. But now, and I want to move from this to Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is upon us, and I think that in many ways on Rosh Hashanah, we could say that most of Rosh Hashanah is kind of a prolonged, very loquacious Sodom moment. Right, for 2 days throughout our tefillot, and they are long and they are involved. They are and very artfully composed, malchiot, zichronot, shofarot, just the right mix of psukim and added text and commentary. Right, in every one of these sections, we argue, we advocate for ourselves in kind of brilliant, sophisticated language, reminiscent of Abraham's negotiations in Sodom. We pull out all the verbal stops. We appeal to God's greatness, to God's mercy, to God's sense of nostalgia, right? Remember us when we were young and right? Remember our zechut avot, every possible reason that we can come up with why we should be spared for the year to come. But what I want to argue is that this as with all verbal communication, this too has its limits, our self-advocating. And in fact, maybe I'm speaking for myself here, I often feel that this constant verbalizing can actually, in some ways, contribute to keeping a person at a respectful distance from what is arguably the real purpose of Rosh Hashanah, which is a kind of raw and authentic cheshbon nefesh. Will I really get to the core of who I am and what my challenges are? And if we can get to that place that's beyond words on this deep experiential level, can we really confront our vulnerabilities, our regrets, our fears, our longings, and much more? And I would argue that to address that level of communication, that level of tefillah, we have a second mode on Rosh Hashanah, which is more of the Akeda mode. It's a mode of silence rather than words, and I think it appears in two ways on Rosh Hashanah. The first one is, of course, reading the story of the Akeda, this silence-infused text. It's a literary style of silence, telling a story about silence. We read that on the second day, but in addition, interspersed throughout our tefillah, throughout this barrage of words, are this kind of jarring, non-verbal blasts of the shofar. Some people might even say an anti-verbal blasts of the shofar. And here there is this very beautiful excerpt that I wanted to bring you from Rav Soloveitchik in his book Yemei Zikaron, where he basically describes what sounded to me very much like a primal scream, right? What is the shofar if not the cry of the human being without speech and without words? It is the cry that spontaneously bursts forth from an animal steeped in agony. In this prayer cry, words are not of primary importance, but rather the grunting sounds of the shofar that need to break out after our verbal prayers have been uttered. The reason is, after one has finished praying, one begins to understand that one's prayer did not manage to express anything of what one wanted to say. In order to express what one wants and needs to express, one begins suddenly to wail or to moan or to emit other animal sounds. In expressing these sounds, one expresses all one has to say, all that is impossible to be expressed in words. Okay, that to me, the Akeda and the shofar as viewed this way are really one. This is a mode of expression that allows for an engagement on levels that we could never reach through all of those, the multitude of words that come out of our mouths.
10-minute warning, Judy.
Thank you very much. Sure. Okay. All right. I want to end with this. Where I'm going with this, I think that Rosh Hashanah basically offers us both versions of Avraham. And I think that in that are really both versions of ourselves. And I will not even take my full 5 minutes. I just want to offer us a joint Yehi Ratzon for us all as we stand before God. And I would say this year and last year and a half, really, right, maybe more aware of our utter powerlessness than ever before. I hope that we can find a way to engage not only our minds and our lips, but the deepest regions of our souls, those regions that words could never possibly reach. And I just want to end with this. We began with the notion that the Torah speaks in human language, Dibra Torah Kilishon B'nei Adam. And as I hope I have illustrated here, the Akeda shows us that this includes the language of the artful silence. And I wanted to leave you with the words of the great pianist Arthur Schnabel, which I think apply well to the elliptical story of the Akeda. He says, "The notes I handle no better than many pianists, but the pauses between the notes, that is where the art resides." I wish all of us Shana Tova, and may we tap into those artful silences that lie deep within ourselves.
Thank you. Before we get to questions, I want to pause first of all and thank you, Judy, for a masterful presentation, really bringing together, we think of Pshat, those of us who are uneducated, we think of Pshat as sort of this flat, sterile almost understanding of text. And that's not true. And you've shown us that today, that with the pauses and with the words and with the people involved and with the real human voices, both spoken and cried and laughed and everything else in between that we have in the Akeda story, there's a real sense of the emotional side as well. Certainly an appropriate introduction to the story of the Akeda, of course, and to the Rosh Hashanah season, which as of last night with Slichot for Rosh Ashkenazim is now upon us. And I also want to thank our captionist Molly for her incredible help this morning. For those of you who took advantage of the captioning, you know how amazing it is to have this opportunity and to be able to learn together. So thank you, Molly. And now with the 6 minutes, 7 minutes that we have left, we'll take some questions. People are welcome to place questions into the chat at this time. And I'm also going to place in the chat just a link back to the schedule if anyone would like to be able to look at the schedule and decide where they're going to go. Our session now ends at 10:45. We'll have a 10-minute break with a little video interlude, and then at 10:55 we'll start again. If you remain in this room, you will have the pleasure of hearing from Rabbi Dov Windsor, YCT's president and Rosh Yeshiva. You can also go back to the main schedule to see the other options that are available beginning at 10:55. Judy, I'll start off with a question that I had actually, which is I went to the Yemei Iyun in Tanakh about 20 years ago at Yeshivat Har Etzion. I heard someone speak at a session about the Akeda, and he suggested that, I don't remember who it was, he suggested that Avraham is stalling throughout the story, that there's a layer of, he got up in the morning, and then he got his animals ready, and then he did, why do I need all this? Like he went, right? So any thoughts on that? And then we'll open it up to other questions in the chat.
Vayakom vayelech, there are midrashim that certainly pick up on that. Vayakom vayelech, what do you need vayakom, right? Of course, if he went, he got up, but you get the sense of, right? That's the beauty of it. There are many, many things that can be read into. There are many, many silences. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes there are additional words that you might say are unnecessary, right? We're looking at the extraneous words and we're trying to understand what are those. That we'll talk about that next time when there are too many words. But it's all there as clues for us. And that's the beauty of it, is that you could create an entire shiur around that assumption. Yes, I didn't, but one certainly could.
One certainly could.
Yes.
A number of people are commenting on the notion in different ways of hester panim, of God's hiddenness, whether in this story where God commands and then kind of things go from there on their own almost until that last, as the blade is dropping. People pointing out the connection to Purim, let's say, where God is really totally absent from the story. Other places in Tanakh where God is quiet, silent in different ways.
I would just say that the intertextual place that I go with the Akeda is the story of Job, and there you have a story, and there are midrashim that notice this. It's a story about the death of. It's God causing the death of innocent children, but there God doesn't stop the death of one child. God not only allows for, but actually brings about the death of 10 children. And the way I understand it is that the book of Job is the opportunity for Avraham to open his mouth and say all the things he never said at the Akeda. So if you want to say what might he have said, take a look at the book of Job, where it's all about the hero saying, I protest. That is a return to, I think, to Avraham and Sodom, right? He finds his Sodomness and he says to God, basically, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. What about mishpat for me? That's where you have it. So I think that's we'll talk about that next time. But there's so much here. There's so much, the story itself and the arrows that go out to all kinds of other places.
Great, lovely.
Yes.
Good.
Oh,
Any other comments from anyone? Please feel free to place them into the chat. Do you think the role of the ellipses and silence from Dylan is felt more in Breshit and Chumash rather than later in Tanakh, where it seems there is longer elaboration on internal turmoil?
in Chumash.
That Chumash feels more brief almost. You get to know the characters later on. The dialogue in Nach, let's say, or Nach Nevi'im and parts of Tuvim is more elaborated and therefore
more fleshed out.
Less of the need for
that's
this.
fair. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes.
Just looking here, there's a bunch of other. Someone points out the Shoah, the same idea. Lots there to,
yes.
to sort of come back.
Oh yes. Oh yes. That is it's classic, and I think you, Rav Yonah, you pointed this out. You said, right, the suggestion that he was actually slaughtered on that mountain. There is a whole school of thought throughout the generations that wanted to view the story as ending with Yitzchak's death, and that's why it says Avraham returned without him. And that allowed people who were going through their own personal akedot to connect to the story, right? This happened, right? This happened to our forefather Avraham. So there's almost a feeling of connection, maybe even some small comfort in knowing that they're part of that chain of akedot.
Right. It was something that I've noticed. Rav Menachem Liebtag, points out that the laning for the other day of Rosh Hashanah is what he calls Akedat Yishmael, sort of the parallel story. I think that's a term that he coined. I'm wondering about how different it is. Where with Yishmael there is, Avram goes, he has a conversation with Sarah. There's more, and then Hashem says, "Oh yeah, do that. Listen to your wife." It's a very different experience than Akedat Yitzchak. It's like two parallel stories, same people, right? And very different experiences and outcomes and everything.
Yes. I think I actually gave this talk in a Yemei Iyun for YCT 10 years ago. If you have it in your files, but yes, it's the buildup and then the switch. It's getting us ready. It's kind of a connector, I think, between Abraham and Sodom, where he gets to use his own sense of justice and logic, and moving him, where God says to him, right? What's Abraham's response in the story of Yishmael when God says he's got to go? Yishmael, kick him out. He allows himself a human reaction, and God says to him, "Al yera be'einecha," no more. That's Sodom. That's not here. Now I want you to become a robot. And then I think that's the preparation for what happens in the Akedah, which has so many of the same components, but it takes this cruel twist, which is nothing. There's none of the humanity is left. It's all about just doing it because God said to do it.
The final question here from Ozzy, who's been typing a lot of interesting questions into the chat throughout our session today. Which is that Eliyahu Hanavi and Moshe Rabbeinu both question God and seem to get a different response. Meaning maybe, Rabbi Grummet often pointed out in the Chumash class at TABC to us, the idea that, wait a second, Moshe's job is to question God, following on Abraham's legacy. But certainly, and Eliyahu also is skeptical. When does it work? When does it not work? Any thoughts on that? And with that, we're going to close.
Is that a question about God? I'm not sure what the question is.
When does it work to question God? When is it inappropriate?
I think that's a question for God. I don't know. I think we can only understand from the internal logic of each one of these stories what it turns out that God wants. Many times, I teach at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. Students are grasping, how can we understand this? And often what they want to say is, Abraham fails the test. The test is he's supposed to say no. But it tells us that this is what God wants. He gives him a yashar koach, right? You get the brachot at the end. We don't know what God wants until God tells us that that's the case, and we're left to kind of work backwards and figure out this is what God wants here. Consistency with God is another question.